reunified. Joining me now is Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He's the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us. The concern over these 2,300 children still separated from their parents, still no answer on how they will be reunited.
Well, unfortunately, that's exactly right. And I think our priority right now, second to none in terms of immigration, ought to be making sure that these kids are reunited with their parents. There ought to be nothing else of importance right now compared with that. And we don't see the kind of urgency to this task that we really ought to by the administration. Sadly, that's not a surprise. The administration was perfectly comfortable with separating parents from their kids as long as it put pressure on the Congress to build the president's wall. So it's not surprising, but nonetheless, here in Congress, we need to insist on better of our country and of our president. We need to make sure these families are reunited.
And we're pressing for answers. We want to know what they will do to get these families back together. But there are different questions than that. The president reversed his decision, which led to the separation of the children and the parents, in a way which would insist that the parents be held alongside the children in detention. I don't think you support that either.
No, I don't. And this is not the choice. It's not just a choice between do we separate kids from their parents or do we lock up entire families. We had a process that worked well before the administration changed that policy, and that is families were allowed essentially to be on probation, where they were monitored intensely, where they were required to show up in court for their court dates. And that program was very successful, particularly with asylum seekers. So like many things the president has done, he has created a crisis where there really wasn't one. We saw this months ago with the Dreamers.
Congressman, there's no question that the policy of separating parents from their children is a situation that he created. That did not exist before. That was something new. But there is a legitimate question about what to do with these parents who do cross the borders with their children. Do you treat them differently than other people crossing the border illegally? So if I'm reading you correctly, you are saying the White House wants to charge each person who crosses the border illegally with criminal charges. You're saying, no, don't do that. We're not going to detain you. If you have kids, we're just not going to detain you, period. That's your answer?
Well, my answer is that we don't have to criminalize everyone that's coming here seeking asylum. That we had a process that I think was effective when people came to the border seeking asylum with their families, with their kids, when they were worried for the life of their children. We didn't treat them as criminals for seeking a way out of the violence. We put them through the asylum process where they would get adjudicated, whether they had a valid asylum case, in which case they could stay, or they didn't have a valid asylum case, in which case they were deported. But we did it in a humane way. And we did that, yes, in part because these are children. And whether the parents have a good case or a bad case for asylum, we weren't about to punish the children. But this president has shown a willingness to punish the children.
If someone crosses the border without children, do you feel it's to detain them?
I think it is appropriate to detain them under certain circumstances, yes.
Then the problem then becomes is, doesn't that incentivize you to bring your child across the border? If you're saying, if you come without a child, you get detained. You come with a child, you don't get detained.
Well, it's not a simple question as whether somebody has a child or not. As I was saying, inappropriate circumstances, where somebody has a culpable claim of asylum, I don't think it's appropriate to treat them as a criminal, whether they have their kids with them or not. I think you do need a mechanism to make sure that they show up in court, and we have a mechanism to do that that was working fine, that can always be improved. But yes, we do treat the situation differently when there are children involved, and I think that's a humane thing to do. But again, not every case is going to be the same, either with kids or without. You've got people who are simply crossing the border, adults unaccompanied by any minors, who are illegal immigrants. They're not seeking asylum. Then you have people who are coming who are seeking asylum. And then you have others coming who are seeking asylum with children. And you don't necessarily treat all those categories of people the same way.
It's a very complicated situation. There's simply no question about that. And sometimes when you try to find a simple answer, it leads to unintended consequences. I don't know whether this was an unintended consequence, separating the children from their parents, or whether it was intended based on the messages that the White House and the administration sent over time. It does seem that they wanted it to be a deterrent. But just last question on this, and I will move to other grounds here. you read the New York Times, you read other stories about people moving toward the border, and you do hear accounts where people will tell you, these immigrants or migrants, when they're there, will tell you, we've been told if we bring a child, we have a greater chance of getting and staying in the United States. Is that a problem?
It's certainly an issue, and we don't want kids to be used this way to try to improve the chances of being able to immigrate to the country improperly. But at the same time, you can't view everyone coming to this country for asylum as somehow a threat to the country or somehow illegitimate or a criminal. That's just not the tradition of this country, and I would hate to see us lose the American value that we do allow refuge for people seeking asylum and seeking a way out of violence.
You are the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, which is why we see you so often, I think, talking about the various investigations. I understand you now want Peter Strzok, who was the FBI agent who was actually marched out of the FBI and is clearly under investigation. The FBI agents who sent text messages that we now know say that he would keep Donald Trump from getting elected. You want him to come testify before your committee. Why?
Well, I think there's a lot that he could offer, and he's expressed a willingness to come to Congress and testify before the relevant committees. So there's information and light he could certainly shed on the Russia investigation and what we've been able to learn about Russian plans and intentions in our last election, Russian coordination with the Trump campaign, the initiation of that investigation. I think he could shed a lot of important light on that. He's also an important witness in terms of the interactions that James Comey had with the president and the issue of obstruction of justice. He may also have information about the allegations that we have seen that there were leaks coming out of the FBI office in New York, a strong anti-Clinton bias in the FBI office in New York, and that whether those leaks went to Rudy Giuliani or went to members of Congress with an intent to be influential in the election.
And I would hope also there are legitimate questions about what he meant when he said he would not let Donald Trump be elected. Of course, the Inspector General said he could not rule out that bias did have some impact in the decisions that Peter Strzok made in the fall. I guess my final question on this is, I think you want to have him testify behind closed doors. Why not have it be out in the open? He's such a controversial figure now, both sides trying to use him to their own devices. How about let the American people hear from him, hear him tell his story and explain what happened?
Well, first of all, John, you're absolutely right. We were interested in any bias that was reflected on those working on the investigation. We learned a lot about the anti-Trump bias in the IG report, but we haven't learned much about the anti-Clinton bias in the New York office. In terms of whether that testimony would be in the open or in closed session, we contemplate that there would be a classified session as well as an unclassified session. Now, whether that will be open or closed, the unclassified session is something we would have to negotiate with Mr. Strzok. But one of the reasons that we agreed as a committee that when the interviews were concluded, we would make all the transcripts public is so that this could be shown to the American people. The Republicans committed to doing that, but, John, they have since refused to fall through on that commitment. And I think one of the reasons is that when you read these transcripts of our interviews, you see how often the majority members were acting like defense lawyers for the president rather than true investigators.
Look, I don't know whether that's the case or not. I do know if you have it in open session, the American people can see it as it happens and they can make the judgment for themselves. So I think that would be great to hear from Peter Strzok.